So I just wanted to welcome everyone on the call, whether you're on video or whether you're on the phone. We appreciate you being here this morning to learn a little bit about redistricting and what impact it has on our voting rights and abilities. I wanted to describe a little bit for you Covenant's Sunday School. Actually, at the end of 2021, started a lesson on justice. And in that conversation, you can't talk about justice with wandering into the topic of injustice. And so one of our members, Sarah Bell Lucas, issued a challenge, which paraphrased was, well, what are we going to do about it? And I just volunteered to host a phone call and a conference call. And here we are, half a year later. We've been meeting on Mondays primarily. And we switched from audio conferencing to Zoom, and haven't looked back. And we're sort of standing on the shoulders of Covenant's rich history, which started in 1887. I have to admit, I looked it up on the church website, but there is a long history of activism and action in the community that we're just adding to at the very end here. So primarily the folks that are in the moral message ministry are Presbyterians, and we're inviting churches from Raleigh and Chapel Hill and other places. So we're also inviting an AME church to join, and we are looking to expand beyond just a single faith tradition, so that someday we may have some synagogue members that would join us, or a mosque member or two that would join. Anybody that is of like mind, that and I don't mean to say like mind like we don't want any challenges. That's exactly what we want, is diversity of perspective and thought, and coming up with an approach that we can lift everybody up and make sure that we have equity and equality and opportunity for everybody. And that's really what this is about. If I had to name sort of one characteristic of this little band of letter writers that I really am proud of and happy about, is we are biased toward action. We don't just meet every Monday and chat about what's going wrong with the world. We have written letters to North Carolina legislators about specific pieces of legislation. We have written letters to our national representatives when we didn't like the way they were voting or not voting or holding things up. And we've even written the president about some things as well, and got a response. So, and we've testified at the redistricting public meetings to give testimony about how redistricting might affect us. And let's see, what was the last one that I wanted to share with you? And one of our members actually got a letter to the editor published in the paper. So we are, sort of continuing to exert what influence we can, and we're looking for more ways all the time to do that, in different ways, whether it be a postcard campaign or something like that. One of the things that came up during our conversations, though, is that we also need to edify ourselves about what's going on in the world, so that we don't just have our own little narrow perspective on what's happening. And so that's that in part. And the Men's Council at Covenant, being interested in redistricting, they asked us to, present to them what we knew about redistricting. And we all looked at each other like, well, we're certainly not experts. So that's where we started looking for some help for some folks that have been at this a little longer than us. And Dr. Jennifer Bremer is going to help show us the way in terms of sort of the historical aspect of redistricting, kind of where we are today, and then looking forward into maybe some ways that, it could be reformed to make it more equitable. So let me see here. Yeah, so I think that really covers the points that I wanted to cover as by way of kind of introducing the whole, how we got to this moment of starting this presentation. So before we get going, and I just spend a minute more to introduce Dr. Bremer, I'm going to ask Pastor Lakeisha to just open us with prayer.
Thank you, Richard. And thank you again to everybody. So far, we have 25 people on this call. That is outstanding, because you could be spending your Saturday morning doing lots of things. So I thank you for joining us today at Covenant Presbyterian Church with members of the Moral Message Ministry. Covenant is absolutely delighted. I mean, I am absolutely delighted to support this group of faithful members and friends from several congregations. This group represents the epitome of faith in action. Let me say that again, faith in action. And I encourage you to lift prayers for their continued work, and also consider joining with them if you'd like to put your faith in action around this subject, or put your faith in action anywhere in the world, because we certainly need it. Join me as I open us in prayer. Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for gathering us this morning. We give you thanks for the Moral Message Ministry, for its organizers and participants. We give you thanks that they heard the spirit of truth as it cries out against political injustice, as it relates to gerrymandering, redistricting, and other forms of voter suppression and disenfranchisement. We give you thanks for walking with them and for walking with us. We pray not only that we are able to learn today, but we can take the things that we learn and put them into action and use our speech and our lives according to what you've asked of us. Open our hearts for this presentation today, and we give you thanks for our presenter, Dr. Jennifer Bremer, and we acknowledge the many who have contributed today in giving us time and their effort. May your spirit continue to be with us, and so it is. Amen.
Amen. Okay, I'll just take a moment to introduce Dr. Jennifer Bremer. She's currently the redistricting lead for the League of Women Voters of Orange, Durham, and Chatham counties. And she is a graduate of Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, and has spent time in other places in the world. And if you were on the call earlier, you heard us talking about, the benefits of getting perspective on America from people who live in other places. And I think it's valuable for people to understand that. So Jennifer is going to bring us, I think, a great presentation this morning. So without further comment, welcome, Dr. Jennifer Bremer.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I really want to thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I am very happy to take questions. If you have a burning question, you can put it in the chat, and Reverend Lakeisha, I think, will decide whether we need to answer it then or leave it to the end. But it is very important for people to, to be able to give their perspectives on this, because it is something that affects all of us, and it affects us in different ways. So I've entitled this Redistricting, looking back at 2021 and ahead to possible reform. And I've put here a picture of the Roman so-called god Janus, who is from which January takes its name, who is looking back on the previous year and looking forward to the next year. So I think that's a good symbol for kind of where we are. And we are not, why am I, let's try again. Okay, there we go. So this is the roadmap of what I'm hoping to cover. Just a quick overview of redistricting and why it matters. And what happened this round? Talk a little bit about the new maps at the state level and some changes in our area. I myself live in Orange, as you can gather, because I'm part of the Orange-Durham Chatham League. So I'll look in particular at that area, and apologies if that's not your area. What's coming next, though? It's redistricting is never over in North Carolina, and how can we fix it? I'm going to be looking at reform options and why, unfortunately, it's harder in North Carolina to get reform. In fact, it's harder in all of the South, which may not come as a surprise to those of you familiar with the difficulties of reform, especially anything with racial implications such as redistricting, and why it could actually get worse if we don't stop it. And it's all a numbers game, but the numbers are really shifting. Our population is changing, and that's going to have an impact on redistricting, as on so many other things. And of course, I want to talk to you about what we can do now to get reform by 2030, which may seem like it's a long way off, but believe me, it's still definitely something that we need to start thinking about and taking action on right now. So to go back the other way, talk a little bit about how we got in this mess. Our founding fathers created strong institutions to ensure citizens' rights. They wanted to protect citizens from abuse of power, which they saw, of course, coming from the monarchy and the colonial government imposed on them. And they wanted to prevent any political faction from becoming entrenched in power. That they hoped we could avoid parties altogether, which of course didn't happen. But they were concerned about one group or party or faction becoming entrenched, and that remains a concern now. They also wanted to provide checks and balances that put limits on political leaders and what they could do that would affect citizens' rights and non-citizens' rights. But to me, when we think about institutions, you might think about, the courts are very much in the news these days, with the legislature, other types of, of course, the governorship or the presidency, other types of leaders and other types of institutions that we have in our country. But to me, on the government side, at least, elections are the most important institution. And that's because they're our institution. This institution belongs fundamentally to the voters. It's designed to express the will of the people and to give voters a voice, and it should give them a choice. And finally, it's very importantly, and sometimes skipped over, it's designed to hold officials accountable to their constituents. It's not enough to say, well, who do we want to govern us going forward? We also need to be able to cast judgment on people that we have elected that perhaps have not performed the way we wanted them to, and to be able to throw them out. This is a fundamental part of our democracy, and one that gerrymandering very much undercuts. Well, redistricting, so what's that? Well, it's essential for fair elections. It should be very simple and straightforward. The purpose is to keep the number of residents in each district about equal as the population changes, so that everyone has an equal vote. And it's done every 10 years after the census. And despite the 2020 census flaws, that census will continue to be the one that we use over the next 10 years. And that's standard. And it should be a straightforward process, just adjusting the lines a little bit to keep the district population the same, and thereby keeping elections fair. And that's what the founding fathers intended when they established redistricting, which has been with us from the very beginning. Instead, it's become an opportunity for the party in charge, whichever one it is, to rig the maps and tilt the elections. And that rigging and tilting is gerrymandering. And in North Carolina, both parties do it. Both of these maps, I use these because they're such obviously both gerrymandered, just from the look of them. Both of these maps were found by the courts to include unconstitutional gerrymanders that were designed to dilute the votes of North Carolina citizens. In the north one, the upper one in 2001 was drawn by the Dems, and then below that in 2011 that was drawn by the GOP. And you can see how they have sort of many features in common, because just by a little bit of shifting here or there, you can shift the advantage from one party to the other. if you're a skillful gerrymander. And of course, we have had some of the most skillful gerrymanders out there. But to me, extreme gerrymandering is also a moral issue. It's cheating, just plain and simple. Just have to understand this as a way to cheat at elections. Now, you look down there at that little basketball court, and you may notice that it looks a little strange. Supposing that you were taking, your kids or grandkids or whatever to the local high school or college basketball game, and you sat down in your seat and you looked down at the court, and this is what you saw. With the center line is not in the center, and some of those free throw lines are a lot easier to get into the basket than the others, and the 3-point lines are also closer for one team than the others. If somebody tried that, if somebody went in and repainted the court, before a game, I mean, what would people do? They would be outraged. They would be throwing things down onto the court. They would totally not accept that in any way. And yet this is what our politicians do. And I don't see why we should expect less of our politicians than we do of our sports teams. So gerrymandering, despite how bad it is in terms of our elections, it undermines our core institutions across the board, in particular with regard to elections. And people really need to understand this is one of the things that makes gerrymandering so difficult to overcome, is that it gives safe seats to incumbents of both parties. It doesn't just benefit the party that's in charge and draws a map to favor itself, but it also benefits those in the legislature or the Congress or the county commission, if you have districts, et cetera, because it creates safe seats for everybody. And this discourages good candidates from running, because it's very difficult to run against somebody who has such a natural advantage or unnatural advantage perhaps before you even start campaigning. But to me, real competition is essential to representative democracy. That's what we want. We want our politicians to have to compete for our votes. And gerrymandering undermines that by giving one party a big edge, whichever party was in charge of drawing the maps. And it denies voters a real choice, because legislators don't really have to listen to the voters. It doesn't matter. They can do what they want. But democracy demands accountability, and gerrymandering prevents us from being able to exercise that by predetermining a large share of the elections. This damage to our core institutions threatens representative democracy. When people see this over and over, that the same people keep winning, and that it doesn't seem to really matter who's nominated, one party or the other is consistently winning in many of our jurisdictions, they start to say, well, why should I vote? Our votes don't count. And voters, especially younger people, they start losing confidence in the system. And they start saying, well, it doesn't seem to matter. I mean, this is all rigged. And you certainly hear that. So this is really damaging to our democracy, to the credibility, not only of the government, but the whole process and the whole set of institutions that are so key to enabling us to govern ourselves as a democracy. It also leads to rising gridlock and incivility, because when the real contest is in the primary, not the general, then you tend to have whether it's Democrats or Republicans, they tend to move towards the extreme, because primary voters typically are the most loyal members of the party, and they tend to be more lefty for the Dems and more on the right for the Republicans. So this contributes to rising gridlock and incivility, which makes it even harder to move forward on issues that are important to us. And that's what I want to emphasize. It's not just about our democracy, no matter how important that is. There are many things that all of us, each of us is concerned about. And look at this list of issues. I mean, many of these things on this list are important to me, and I suspect they're important to most of you, whether it's jobs or economic opportunity, infrastructure, education, environment, national security, healthcare, criminal justice, and justice in general, housing. That list could go on. That's kind of the more local ones, but there's a long list of things I'm sure that each of us cares about, especially things that determine whether or not we will have a better North Carolina for our children and our children's children. But if you care about any of these things, then you have to care about gerrymandering too, even if it's a little wonky, because gerrymandering prevents us from moving ahead on any of them. It really makes it difficult to hold politicians accountable, and that means they don't have to be responsive to what the voters want. And one party is pretty much assured of staying in power, no matter what they do. And this has been true, as I showed with the maps. It has been true of the Democrats when they were in charge, and true of the Republicans when they're in charge. But redistricting is really not, should not be thought of as a Democratic issue or a Republican issue, as I was saying. This is an American issue. And we will now see if I can get, let's see, I'm using a somewhat different system. So let's hope I can actually get this video to play. No? Yes.
Fair deal.
Whoops.
And that's all we're asking for, an end to the anti-democratic and un-American practice of gerrymandering congressional districts. In 1984, there were 397 congressional races contested by both parties. In the races, Republicans won 500,000 more votes than the Democrats, but the Democratic Party won 31 more seats. In California, one of the worst cases of gerrymandering in the country, Republicans received a majority of votes in congressional races, but the Democrats won 60% more races. The fact is, gerrymandering has become a national scandal. The Democratic-controlled state legislatures have so rigged the electoral process that the will of the people cannot be heard. They vote Republican, but elect Democrats. A look at the district lines shows how corrupt the whole process has become. The Congressional Map is a horror show of grotesque, contorted shapes. Districts jump back and forth over mountain ranges, cross large bodies of water, send out little tentacles to absorb special communities and ensure safe seats. One Democratic congressman who helped engineer the gerrymandering of California once described the district lines there as his contribution to modern art. But it isn't just the district lines the Democrats have bent out of shape. It's the American values of fair play and decency. And it's time we stop. Frank Fahrenkopf and the Republican Party have challenged the Democrats' gerrymandering in court. But ultimately, it's in the state legislatures that the battle for fairness must be won.
I think you can see, from what President Reagan said, that he's making the same arguments that you hear the Democrats making in Republican-controlled states about how bad gerrymandering is and what it does. And he was actually a very strong opponent of gerrymandering throughout his life, as were a number of other Republican leaders when they were in the outs. So this is something that really is not a partisan issue per se, and I'll have some poll data that shows that there is at this point fairly strong opposition to a gerrymandering on both sides, left and right, and this is something that we really have to really make an effort not to make this a partisan issue, because that makes it more difficult to arrive at a shared solution. And in fact, so here you have some of those poll results, and let me see if I can just move this out of the way so I can see the numbers. These were polls that were done in 2018 and early in 2019, showing, and these were done by Public Policy Polling, which is sometimes considered to be Democratic leaning, but is one of our better, if not the best of our polling organizations. Happens to be based in North Carolina, but operates nationally. And their question was, is ending gerrymandering in North Carolina an important voting issue for you? And you can see that that on the top line is that the vast majority of voters have opposed it in 2018 and have opposed it even more strongly in 2019. And I'll have some more recent results in a moment. But this report is definitely stronger. Support for that is definitely stronger among the Democrats than it is among the Republicans. It's also very strong among independents who kind of are caught in the middle on this. But we've seen an evolution in the view of the Republicans, whereas it was still a minority in 2018. A year later, it had moved to a majority. And I had not seen that earlier, where a poll would show that a majority of North Carolina Republicans said that this was an important issue for them and something that they would vote on. And then we have some even more recent polling, but they used a different question. But it seemed that support, as we got closer to the actual redrawing, it seems that maybe voters backed a little bit away from their, from wanting to support reform, thinking, well, maybe this will benefit my party. And so you can see, for example, but the question is also different. So they asked them not, is redistricting an important voting issue? They asked them, do you support nonpartisan redistricting? And although that, I think that may be unintentionally a slightly, a sort of a leaning question in a way, because, or one that confused people as well, because people might say, well, what does it mean nonpartisan redistricting? Is such a thing possible? You're asking me, do I support something, but I'm not really sure what you're talking about. But nonetheless, you still had a substantial majority of Democrats saying that they supported it, and an almost a majority of Republicans, and again, a strong share of independents. So there's really no question that the voters are sick of this. They don't like it when the Dems do it. They don't like it when the Republicans do it. And they really want to see reform. And in fact, here's an even more recent, from 2021, this poll was done by representatives. And again, they changed the question. When you're looking at poll results, you always have to look at the specific, the specific question and how it's phrased. Because here they asked if you support or oppose gerrymandering. And people who aren't even sure exactly what gerrymandering is know it's supposed to be bad. But nonetheless, Trump voters said that they opposed it, 89% of them. And they asked, do you expect your state's maps to be gerrymandered? More than half of them said yes, they did. More of the Dems, and as in all the others, pretty much. And they said, well, if our state's maps are gerrymandering, how much of a problem is that? Again, a majority saying, of the Trump voters saying it's a major problem. And should maps be, we asked them if they were concerned about maps being biased toward a political party, and the Trump voters said yes, by a large share. And they asked if legislators should be prohibited from participating in the process. Again, 2/3 of the Trump voters said they thought the legislators should not be part of it. Higher for the Dems, but still 64% is very strong support in a poll. But I also want to call your attention to these don't know categories, because a substantial amount of Trump voters said that they just didn't know. And maybe some of them were avoiding the question, but I think for them, as for the 15% among Biden voters, a lot of voters just don't know that much about redistricting. I mean, it's shocking, right? No, it's not. This can be a conflict. At base, it's very simple. Is your vote going to count or not? Is your voice going to be heard or not? But it is the details can get sort of messy. So it's very important to educate people about what's really at stake here and why it matters and how we can change it. So like I said, this is a moral issue, plain and simple. Think back to that basketball court. That's not a complicated question. We need to get change in this because gerrymandering is just wrong. But you might say, okay, so how do they do it? What is gerrymandering? Let us attempt again to see if I can get this to work.
Partisan redistricting, or gerrymandering, is about fractions, percentages. These coins represent voters in an evenly divided state, 50 dimes, 50 pennies. These 100 coins elect 10 representatives. That means each voting district must contain 10 coins. Now, real people don't live in neat rows, so let's mix them up. Okay, this is our hypothetical evenly divided state. Let's see what happens if the dimes draw the maps, 10 coins in each district. For the dimes, first thing we do is pack the pennies, give them 2 safe districts, but pack them solid. The remaining 8 districts are won by the dimes, by smaller but still comfortable margins. The dimes win 8 districts and the pennies win 2. the dimes overwhelmingly control the legislature. Of course, if the pennies drew the district lines, the opposite would be true. Let's rig it for the pennies. For the pennies, we follow the same pack and crack strategy. Pack the dimes into 2 safe districts and crack the remaining 8 districts to win by the same margin, 8-2. Well, now that we've destroyed democracy, let's consider what this map would look like if the districts were drawn for compactness and keeping communities of interest together. You get evenly divided districts in an evenly divided state. Some go heavily dime, some go penny, but that's to be expected. People live where they live, and that is what democracy is about. It's not about party bosses rigging election districts so they can fix the election results.
So there you Okay, is that okay? Okay, I don't know why that happens. Anyway, to me, that explanation is the clearest that I've been able to find of redistricting and how it differs from gerrymandering. I'm sure you've heard the terms packing and cracking, and now you can see how it works. Whatever party you want to defeat, you pack their voters into as few districts as possible, with the result that they win those overwhelmingly. But there are far fewer of them, therefore, in the other districts, and you can win those. And that is the basic strategy which both parties use with variations. But let's look also at how the maps are actually drawn, and what are the questions that can help us in understanding the different system options that are out there. Redistricting can get complicated, but we did a study we looked at 50 bills that have been introduced around the country a couple of years ago and tried to really see how we could summarize what options people were looking at and what different systems were out there. And we came up with these 3 questions, which we think are fairly simple and straightforward as to how you define a redistricting system. The first question is who draws the maps? And the second question is who approves the maps? And for both of those first 2 questions, you have the same options. Either the legislative leaders draw the maps, or you have a commission of voters or commission or experts or whatever who draws the maps. And those same options apply then to who approves the maps once they're drawn. Either it's the legislative leadership or the commission approves the maps, and that's final. And you notice that I put legislative leaders, not legislature. And that was not some kind of an oversight. The control of who draws the drawing of the maps is very tightly controlled by the leadership of the party that's in charge. This time we saw a little bit of collaboration between the 2 parties in one of our legislative houses, but that was entirely up to the decision of the leadership of the party in charge. And the third question often gets a lot of attention: how are the maps drawn? What's the process? Is there transparency? Do citizens have a chance to testify? Can you get to see the maps? Can you watch the drawing? How does it actually go on? And then what criteria do they use to decide what is a legitimate map? For example, do they have to keep districts compact? It's almost always required that they be contiguous, in other words, one piece, except sometimes the islands can be included with the mainland, but the basic principles, it has to all be one piece. You want to keep communities whole. You don't want to have political data or political objectives, ideally. And of course, you want to comply with the Voting Rights Act and Constitution and so forth. So those 3 sets of questions: who draws the maps, who approves the maps, and how are the maps drawn? You answer those and you've pretty much defined your system. There may be a lot more details, but really those first 2 questions are the most important. People often get drawn into discussing the third one because that's where there's a little bit more wiggle room, even in a state like North Carolina, but those first two are really the most important ones. If the legislative leaders are going to draw and approve the maps, then the chances are very high that you're going to get gerrymandering, because there really is not a good system for holding them accountable for following whatever rules that they have put on paper. And we feel that the answer should in fact be the second choice in each of those, that a citizens commission made up of voters across the spectrum, not politicians, should draw the district maps. They should draw them, and ideally they should approve them as well. And they should use a good set of a process and criteria rules as well. But again, the key thing is who is making those decisions, who holds the pen when those lines are being drawn. So how was it done in 2021? Move this again out of the way here. Well, there were lots of smoke and mirrors, but there was the same basic model that we've had before. In fact, the legislative leaders, presumably with some pretty serious consultants in the background, although they tried to pretend that there weren't, legislative leaders, who are all Republicans at the present time, drew the maps. There was some negotiation on the House map, which is a little bit fair as a result. After they went through one round of court challenges, I think they were trying to make it look good, so they enabled some Democrats to draw parts of the map, and it's a bit fairer. But in the Senate, our state Senate, they could not agree to collaborate, so it's less fair. And the congressional map was ended up being drawn by court-appointed special masters, and that who were bipartisan. And so that map ended up a little bit more fair, but it also means it can only last for one election under the law of North Carolina. There was minimal real public input, but lots of public interest. People came to the hearings, people made comments, but I have to say that the impact of that was relatively modest. There are only a couple of places where you can point to a change that was made in response to even repeated public comments on a particular part of the map. There were some successes overall. We don't just redraw our legislature and our Congress. We also redraw many of our county commissions, some city councils, some school boards are by district. And so there were some modest changes that were proposed by voters in the legislature that got included, but also there were some successes in county redistricting. So it's not, it was not, it was a little bit mixed, but very definitely we still ended up with gerrymanders in the key bodies that we are concerned about, the legislature and the Congress. So how do we fix it? Well, we, looking again at our three questions, just to go over these again, because we think this really helps in understanding, what the different systems are. Who draws the maps? Is it the legislative leaders or is it a commission? Who approves them? Same choices. Do the legislative leaders have final say? And again, it's the leaders. It's not the whole body. They control this very tightly. And occasionally, stick the knife into some of their own party members if it's part of a deal. Or is it a commission that approves the maps? And how are they drawn? So these are the key questions. And to me, the most important point is that we need a citizens commission where voters, not politicians, draw the district maps. And I'll talk in a minute about the experience in some other states that tried various kinds of reform and how those have worked. So what are the options for reform? Well, first we have independent commission. An independent commission means that it is, at least to a large extent, separate from the legislature or the governor or what have you. Oh, and I should mention that in North Carolina, this is kind of ironic. Governor Cooper, when he was in the legislature, he was one of the leaders who led to the decision to give the governor a veto, but to limit that veto in certain areas. And one of the areas that, and as I understand it, he was in charge, on one of the houses. So they said that the governor would have no role in redistricting. And at that time, the Democrats had controlled the legislature for something like 100 years, just about. And so I'm sure it never entered his mind that he would be on the losing side of that. But there you go, things turn around. So the governor cannot veto maps in North Carolina. So but the two reform options, you can have an independent commission with a tripartisan group of voters selected through a transparent process. In California, they have video interviews and their full portfolios of people who apply are, after they've screened them out, are available for review. And by tripartisan, I mean you should have Democrats and Republicans, but you should also have people who represent unaffiliated voters. And you also want that to be a diverse group that reflects the diversity of the state. You want to have strict rules in place for the process of how the maps are drawn and for the criteria that decide which map is in fact acceptable. You want extensive citizen involvement in hearings where it really makes a difference, where they're going in place to place and people can really have input and not just the very condensed hearings that we had. And you want the maps to become final on the commission's vote. Since the commission is made up of voters who represent the range of the voters in the state who draw and approve the maps, that is, we think, is the best system. Then there's some second best solutions that where you're trying to constrain the legislature, but they're still really in charge. They keep the legislature right at the heart of the process. Some of them create commissions, but they only advise the legislature. They don't actually approve the map finally. And they usually have rules for processing criteria that maybe are defined in the law or even in the Constitution adopted by referendum. And you have still have court involvement, and often is necessary particularly in these sort of halfway reforms to get a map approved. But the idea is to at least try to limit the legislature. And so we want to look at, well, how did the recent reforms perform in 2021? And I have to say, very disappointingly, we had very mixed results. Some states already had in place or adopted a true independent commission model where the commission draws and approves the maps. For example, Colorado and Michigan both adopted reforms. In the case of Colorado, the legislature actually voted for it, but it was not the act of open-mindedness that you might think from that, because in fact there were two very rapidly and very similar fast-moving efforts to collect signatures and put something on the ballot. And so they decided that they would jump ahead of that and adopt something very close to what the voters were asking for. So you have, again, a tripartisan group of voters selected with some input from the legislature. People often think, well, this means the legislature has no role. That's not really the case. There is not a system at any place in the country where the legislature has no role. They usually are involved, perhaps, as in California, in throwing out some of there's a pool of applicants created, and then that is narrowed down. And then before the final choice is made, the legislative leaders often have an opportunity to throw some of them out. In California, interestingly enough, from talking to the California commissioners, it turned out that that process made for a better commission because the Republicans and the Democratic leaders from the legislature sat down together. They looked at the list, and the Democrats threw out the most extreme Republicans, and the Republicans threw out the most extreme Democrats before the final selection was made. And as a result, the pool was more in the middle, and they probably got a better commission. So the process can sometimes work in surprising ways. Then they draw the maps in a transparent process, following strict procedures with extensive citizen input. These models of a really strong commission model perform very well. Other states made partial reforms and ended up, unfortunately, with flawed models. New York, I was very interested in New York and Virginia in particular, because those were cases where the legislatures had adopted a reform. In New York in 2014 and Virginia more recently than that. And so this was the first time they were tried. And Utah also had something that was adopted by referendum. The citizens voted on it, proposed it and voted on it. But in Utah, the legislature gets to change what the voters had proposed. Ohio voters also adopted a reform that did not remove politicians from the process. And that was because they had in fact tried many times to get the Ohio voters to approve a true commission, and they had failed, I think, 5 times. So they said, okay, let's try something more modest in its aims and still leave the politicians in charge. And unfortunately, all 4 of those, New York, Virginia, Utah, and Ohio, those were all at least this last round, were really a serious disappointment. And they ended up in every case with the courts either drawing the maps or the legislature drawing the maps, and there being no real way to get rid of bad maps. So I was hopeful, because we would be more likely, obviously, to get a partial reform than one that would remove it from the legislature almost entirely. But at least the models that were tried, and they were quite different from each other, none of them worked. Yeah, also I could add Florida, which had adopted a reform earlier that was just criteria. That did not work either. So what are our prospects for reform? I would really like to be able to say, well, guys, just go out, we're almost there, push a little harder, we'll get it done. And I'm going to be honest and say that is by no means the case. We have really gotten essentially no reform yet, and it is going to be very difficult in North Carolina. All of the truly independent commissions were put in place using voter referendum, and we don't have that. And like so many other things in our state, why don't we have it? We don't have it because of Jim Crow. There was an effort being made across the country, the turn of the previous century, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, to introduce a set of reforms. And one of them was to enable voters to put something on the ballot. But that was not adopted anywhere in the South. And there's a partial thing in Florida and a partial thing in, I believe it's Mississippi, but nowhere else. And even those are very limited. So that's not an option. We cannot do that. The only way that we can get reform in a systematic way is for it to go through the legislature. In the 2020 round, we ended up with strong court supervision, and that put real pressure on the legislature to draw better maps once the maps were challenged in court. And that was a reasonably good process. In fact, they were required to redraw, and they did make them somewhat fairer. So that is something, but that is not by any means a solution, because the maps are still pretty rigged. However, our state is changing. So we all know the proportion of minority voters is rising, and the diversity of our minority population is also increasing, with particularly the rapid growth of the Latino and the Asian populations. And so we're seeing a much more diverse state. The question is, will that result in a change in the balance of power between the Democrats and the Republicans, or will it not? And that is still that no assumption should be made about that. I think that people often say, oh, well, minority voters, they're definitely going to vote Democratic. No, that's not the case. In fact, there are, there's real, if you support more liberal policies, or more, less conservative policies, there's a lot of work to be done in that area, as with voters, across the board, across the state. But nonetheless, there will be an overall tendency, as the electorate becomes more diverse, for there to be, if people play their cards right, there will be a move of the electorate to the left. And at some point that will reach the point where the Republicans say, this is looking too iffy. We need to put a system in place so that whatever happens, we're not going to get completely, completely destroyed, and have something that's more in the middle. So there is some hope, but at the same time, it's not going to happen by itself. So let's look at, before we wrap up here, let's look at the actual maps that we ended up with. You can see the overall congressional map on the left, and the colors, the darker blue means more Democratic. And we have 6 Democratic leaning state districts, and 7 Republican leaning districts, and 1 highly competitive seat in sort of Southern Wake and Johnston and so forth. And the change, there is some change from the old map, in that there's 1 more Democratic leaning seat and 1 less Republican leaning seat, and also this 1 highly competitive seat. On the looking at our local level specifically, Orange is grouped with Durham, but not Chatham. This is kind of this mix. They're always fooling around with that mix, but this is what we have for this election, at least. As I say, the maps will be redrawn next year under North Carolina law, and the legislature is also challenging the congressional map in the Supreme Court. And this case which the court has not yet accepted, but it's believed that they will accept it. That case could potentially end democracy as we know it. So don't worry about it too much. But it could potentially eliminate judicial review of federal elections. So no more challenging maps in court, no more challenging anything in federal court when it comes to elections, if that case goes the way the Republican challengers hope that it will. I'm not going to talk about that more because it's not only redistricting, but I would be happy to answer questions. The legislative maps, pretty much the same story. These are all done unless somebody brings a new suit. These are a little bit fairer, but there are only 6 competitive seats. They kind of move to produce fewer competitive seats. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. It's not true. They get that. So there are it moved to become a little bit more fair. I'll just put it that way. There are in the new map. There are a few more swing seats on the Democratic side of the map in the Senate, and quite a few more in the House. But the majority is still pretty much safely, in most years, would be safely Republican. It's potentially could go Democratic in the House, particularly with the demographic shift as we move down down through the years. And you can see at the top, comparing again our local area, where as usual they're fooling around with where they put Durham, in the old map, Durham itself was its own district, then this time it's lumped in with Chatham in the Senate. I didn't show the House just because it's got too many districts to easily discuss. Orange was moved around. Instead of being associated with Chatham, we're now associated with Caswell and Person. But they have a very small population, so it's still basically Orange's district. So what's next? Well, the congressional drafts are going to be redrawn in 2024. As I mentioned, the Supreme Court case, it's going to I don't know why it says sanctify. I think that's a typo. Anyway, the Supreme, on my part, it's going to potentially change the role of the legislature. I'm sorry, no, it is going to sanctify the role of the legislature in federal elections. Sorry. The Constitution says that that the legislatures determine how congressional elections are held. And heretofore, going all the way back to shortly after the founding of the country, that has provided somewhat informally for review by the courts. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about judicial review of anything. And that's pretty much true of the North Carolina Constitution as well. It says that the courts are the final arbiter of the meaning of the Constitution. So there's somewhat more ground there. But in federal elections, there's nothing in the national Constitution about judicial review. It was invented after the Constitution was put in place. But there's been recently this idea that that this constitutes an independent legislature doctrine, also called the independent legislature theory, that the founding fathers meant for the legislatures to be independent, not to be subject to court review, not to be subject to anything, but theoretically the voters electing them. And this could now very likely be heard in a North Carolina case, like so many of the big redistricting cases. And if it is to be heard, we should know sometime next month. The Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, will say whether or not they're going to hear this case, which is an appeal from one of our redistricting suits. And if it is just, and it appears that there are 4, maybe 5 justices who are prepared to approve the independent legislature doctrine. This is just very scary, people, because it says that you could not have federal court review of federal elections. And it could even extend, to other things. And in particular, in the Constitution, there's one other very important thing that is assigned to the legislatures, and that is how to select the presidential electors. There's nothing in the Constitution about how that is done. It evolved, as we all know, to become, the system whereby the majority of whoever wins the majority of the vote generally speaking, wins all of the electors from that state. But that is state by state law at this point. But if the independent legislature doctrine is adopted by the Supreme Court, then that would mean that in fact the legislatures can do whatever they want, and that is quite likely, due to a competitive process, to lead to legislatures deciding that they don't necessarily need to abide by the popular vote. I hate to say that, but that's the case. But it could be even worse, because this applies only to the federal Constitution, but they could extend it. So what do we need to do, folks? This is not the time to sit on our hands. Our democracy is very much at risk. We need to keep educating voters about why gerrymandering is important and why it affects their lives and what can be done about it. We also need to keep the North Carolina court bipartisan. Right now, there are 2 Supreme Court justices on the ballot. We also need to keep our eyes on the Congressional Map redrawing, which will happen next year. And most important, we need to keep pressing the legislature for reform, because there are new voters coming, and we hope that that will lead to new opportunities for reform. So you have your marching orders. We can talk about that more in the Q&A, which is right now. So I hope somebody's watching the chat, or you can raise your hands, or however you want to do it. Anybody?
Yeah, Dr. Bremer, just let me thank you for a fabulous overview and call to arms, if you will. It was really well done. Appreciate it very much. So.
Oh, thank you. I've probably given this presentation 100 times. Variations on it. I update it every time.
My question.
Somebody want me to look at the chat, or how do you want to do
No,
it?
I have a question.
Sure.
How do we go about forcing voter reform?
the redistricting reform, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, although the answer would be the same for almost anything in voting reform. The thing about gerrymandering is it makes it very difficult to force reform, because normally you would say, well, you need to vote the rascals out, but that's not really possible unless, well, let me back up on that one step. To me, the most important thing, because you saw, and I emphasized, that Republican voters have moved. They now see, in part, frankly, because of the threat of minority voters, that they don't necessarily have the ability to control this. And that moment of uncertainty creates an opportunity that you might be able to get Republicans to support reform defensively, fearing that they might not be able to control despite their gerrymandering in 2031. So, but a big part of that is getting Republican voters to oppose gerrymandering and to be willing to take action. And we made an effort to try to reach out to Republicans. And I have to say, we were generally not very successful in getting Republicans to hear us, because they can kind of tell that we're not on their side. When I say we, I mean the League's effort that I led before I led for several years before focusing on Orange. But what we really need to do is to get to Republicans. And I think the faith communities are an excellent channel for trying to reach through various interfaith options that are out there, to try to reach out, across the aisle and to try to speak, to arrange speaking opportunities for Republicans, or talk to people that you know individually, or make the case that gerrymandering is just immoral. It's cheating, and if you don't want elections stolen, well, then maybe gerrymandering is a good place to start, because naturally our state is, as we all know, is very divided geographically, and the more the more we can get to Republican voters, the more likely it is that their Republican legislators will be open to reform. And that is a difficult thing to do, but as I say, I think the faith community is one channel, a good channel to try to help make that happen. You can also, if you friends and neighbors, to try to just sort of spread the word. I'm always happy to speak to Republicans, Rotary groups, other types of business groups. I managed to speak once to a Republican club, but it's difficult to place speakers at Republicans organizations. And there are Republicans out there also who do support reform, very definitely. And some of them have been spokespersons for redistricting reform. Such as
Dr. Bremer, I wondered about, isn't there also sort of a North Carolina constitutional boundary that we would have to overcome as well? Or is that more about the lack of ability to have a voter referendum?
Yeah, I think they kind of overlap, because the only way you can achieve reform, is by legislation, and the legislature has the power to decide how the maps are drawn, and it is specified in the Constitution that the legislature draws the maps. But an advisory commission that drew the maps for the legislature's approval, that would be constitutional, because having the power to draw the maps certainly would, I'm not a lawyer, but would include, I would assume, the right to ask somebody, and they do it all the time, so why not have a public group draw the maps, and they could constrain themselves, requiring a supermajority to overrule that or whatever. But they cannot, they could not, eliminate themselves from the center of the redrawing, except through constitutional amendment. But guess who gets to decide what the constitutional amendments are? The legislature, and then they must be ratified by the voters. But you cannot put something on the ballot unless you're the legislature. And then they do, certainly we saw, a couple of years ago, we saw a number of constitutional amendments proposed. So they could change it, either a partial change to create a commission that would draw the maps and then limit their ability to modify them, if not eliminate that ability, or they could introduce a constitutional amendment.
Okay, thank you.
We can't.
Scott Woodall asked the question, I'm familiar with Common Cause North Carolina. What other organizations are active in public awareness or changing legislative opinion?
Yeah, we work a lot with Common Cause. There's also the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, which is very active. I mean, most of the cases that have been brought, not all of them, Common Cause has brought some directly, but SCSJ, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, which is headquartered in Durham, as far as I know, has certainly been very active. Democracy NC, which started in Durham, but is now located in Morrisonville, Airport Parkway, wherever that is. There's a partisan group, All on the Line, which it's a national group started by former Attorney General Holder. Those, I think I've got the main groups there. I'm sort of assuming the league doesn't need mentioning further. But there are a lot of other groups. We certainly.
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I didn't do anything. It said the host muted me.
Oh, maybe that was just an accidental thing.
Yeah, I think somebody.
Yeah, a couple of us from the Moral Message Ministry are attending the All on the Line meetings and stuff too. So we're, cross-pollinating there as best we can.
Yeah, I attended a lot of those too. And they do good work. They are a quasi-partisan organization. But with that being said, they certainly do good work. I know Bree was originally, hoping to be on this as well. So from All on the Line. Yeah, I'm sure there are a variety of local groups and so forth. But I think those are the main ones.
Donna, go ahead.
Hi, this was fabulous, but I want to get to the point that the Voting Rights Act, I don't even know how to state this, but the implications, naturally, the gerrymandering is one thing, but it is also complicated because of the lack of the guts behind the Voting Rights Act. I don't understand why we're not putting more pressure on Congress to get it back where it was before 2013, was it?
Yeah.
When it was pulled back. What was that? Shelby versus
Holder.
yes. Okay, so how are we incorporating that in this issue? Because that is very much a big deal.
No, I totally agree with you. I mean, the loss in particular of Shelby v. Holder, which got rid of the preclearance, and also more recently, another case out of Arizona, Brnovich, which also weakened Section 2, which was, not affected by Shelby v. Holder, which is, so they, and there's a lot of, I hate to say, I guess it's really, it shouldn't even be, you shouldn't have to say, but it seems the Supreme Court is, certain elements on the Supreme Court, of course, not the whole court, are bound and determined to weaken the Voting Rights Act. Now, the answer for that, as you mentioned, is to get it, restored in Congress, because whatever the deficiencies that they found, and for example, I understand that in North Carolina, the way they chose the 40-something counties that were included in the mandatory review of anything that would affect voting, were selected based on who had a literacy test and that was actually being used. So
Right.
they had to do it in a hurry. So that's what they picked. People say, well, that's not really a hard and fast process, and some places that maybe should be included weren't, and vice versa. So there's no doubt that the Voting Rights Act could be further strengthened, but unfortunately, it's yet another thing where Manchin and Sinema are blocking it, and until we get to the point where I said this isn't. I mean, since I'm not speaking for the league, I can actually be partisan, I guess. I don't know. Sherry Beasley, people. We need to have a Democratic control of the Senate, that is stronger, because Manchin and Sinema are not going to move. The danger is that the Manchin would shift, and that would also be a challenge. But nonetheless, be that as it may, I agree with you totally. There's no excuse that law has been adopted over and over, and updated over time and extended in terms of its period of viability, usually unanimously, and it's just shameful that they can't get it through.
So James Henderson from Covenant asked, can we steal, in air quotes, Dr. Bremer's basketball court example? This is an excellent way to teach voters in this area.
Oh, I'm glad you like it.
Yeah, I really liked
sure.
I really liked I liked the pennies and dimes video too. That was really a great way to do it.
Yeah, that comes from this larger movie, Line on the Street, that is focused on the effort to get reform in Pennsylvania, which failed. And despite an unbelievable effort, I mean, there were hundreds of presentations literally made around the state, but the legislature just crossed its arms and wouldn't respond. And there was no, they, like us, got court cases to affect specific maps, but they could not get legal reform. So yeah, absolutely. But Line on the Street is also a good educational tool. There are other films about redistricting out there also. So those can be educational. Rigged, the movie, which also goes through a variety of different voter suppression methods, is another good. Then there's a film from Virginia where they were able to get reform. Didn't work, but they did the best they could. I mean, and to get it through the legislature is a tremendous accomplishment. And I'm not denigrating what they did at all. They did their very best. They worked for years to get that to happen. So they have a good short movie as well. So there are a lot of educational materials out there. The problem is getting venues. We need to get, even though it seems like redistricting is a ways off, this has to be a decade-long effort to get it to happen.
Well, yeah, when we particularly realized that, you know, the current maps are going to basically be redrawn again in a year, right? I mean, as soon as we get into January, they're going to go to work.
Yeah,
As
it's
soon
just
as-
a congressional map, and unless there are other challenges against the state maps, which I don't expect,
Okay.
could happen. But the congressional map by law, if it's imposed by a court, only lasts for one election, so it will be redrawn.
Okay. So anyone else? I think I covered all the questions that were in the chat. Does
There's a couple of
anybody
more- there's
else have a question? Go ahead.
There's a couple of more people who have questions, but I also wanted to jump in and just thank you, Dr. Bremer. Excellent presentation. And I especially like the framing that this is a moral issue, that this is a challenge, this is stealing and all the worst thing, I won't say worst things, but these are problems and challenges that we have. And I think considering it from a faith perspective may be helpful as we talk to people who we know in our families and around us who support this with their vote. And so keeping it as a space of faith conversation may be helpful as we do that. So thank you so very much. You have a question that says, which states are the most fair regarding redistricting and which ones are the least fair?
I think thank you for that. And I think positioning it as cheating, because it is cheating, is kind of makes it an easy thing to explain, that they have this system, and you don't have to go into the details, that enables them to to draw the lines in such a way that one side wins even if it gets fewer votes, and that people that it's voters against politicians is an easier case to make than the partisan case, and both sides have done it. So and the I'm sorry, now I managed to forget your second question. Say it again, please.
Which states have the most fair
Oh, yeah.
redistricting and the least?
The independent commissions that are really independent have worked well. I mean, California and Michigan's is almost identical, that they just adopted. And analyses of the different maps show that the commission drawn maps are fairer. The citizen commission or voter commission drawn maps are fairer. And so that really is the gold standard. And they have been adopted only in states where they could put something on the ballot. And I mean, I guess there's an outside chance that we could try to push to get an amendment for voter referendum or citizen initiated referendum. I see it as really unlikely, but it is something that we could certainly try to push. I mean, I think we could get it introduced, but you have to get 60% in each house to pass to put something on the ballot, and then of course it has to be passed by the voters. But I don't know. Many people that move to the state are shocked that we don't have it. But it's not a coincidence that that it was adopted around the country mostly around the turn of the previous century. And I like to say that while the rest of the country was doing the progressive era, we were doing Jim Crow. So a lot of those reforms passed us by.
Okay, we've got another question. Amy Symes is asking, I realize it's probably a moot point now, but what are the specifics of the Berger Moore v. Harper case?
Oh, that was where Harper is a voter, but that was, I'm pretty sure, the Common Cause case, where they were challenging the maps. And so then they officially challenged the legislature, but in the way the court cases are named, they named the heads of the legislature as the defendants. And then they appeal that to the Supreme Court, which makes them the plaintiffs against Harper. But that's basically it's the Common Cause case. Because you have to have individual voters who are harmed, since Common Cause doesn't have what's called standing, that they're not they're not really harmed as an institution. The harm is to the voters. So you have to select a group of voters to include in your complaint to the court that for, you know, asking them to take action. So it's yet another, it's just the appeal to the US Supreme Court. They didn't take it most recently because of the timing. It was appealed, you know, like way too late for them to hear it before the election. But there were 4.5 of them who said that they sort of seemed in their decision to be willing to take it going forward. And it has been resubmitted by the legislature. Normally, the Supreme Court announces in June which cases they're going to take in the coming session, which begins in October. So it would then normally be heard like maybe in like March or something. I mean, whatever. It would be heard in that October to June session.
Great, thank you. I think that's it. Any other questions from anybody on the phone or in the chat? Please jump in. We've got just about 2 minutes left on my watch.
Yes, Richard.
Pierre,
Yes, how are y'all?
doing well.
Good. I have a question.
Go ahead.
First off, Ms. Bremer, are you related to the author Ian Bremer?
I don't think the guy who shot Wallace or another one.
No, this is I'm looking at a book that that is entitled "The Way Forward in Changing in Geopolitical World." But since you're not related to him, I'll move on.
I could be related to him because there does seem Arthur is a name on that side of the family, but I'm not aware of any relationship.
Yeah, yeah.
It's also kind of a German title, so there are many unrelated people with that name. It means people who were on the council in the city council in Bremen.
Well, that's pretty interesting right there then. But I plan on getting that book. It seems to really offer a very unique way of the world changing its economic and political views. But my one concern is that our institutions and documents have inherent vestiges of racism and sexism built in. And we're now seeing that one of the institutions of our government, the judicial side, seems to have no checks or balances. And that's being now demonstrated in the actions of a very activist Supreme Court. I had hoped initially that we could have written a letter going out to all of the 50 states, the federal elect representatives, you know, the House of Representatives and the Senate to address this issue of unfair voting. And it just seems that gerrymandering and the archaic debate law there in the House of Representatives, these are all things that we should just absolutely discount. And I was hoping that we might be able to get a letter off. Have we sent a letter off, or has the letter been sent off to any of the representatives other than North Carolina at this point?
So yeah, Pierre, what I'd like to do, because we've got a broader audience here than just the Moral Message Ministry folks, and we are at the end of time, I can answer that. We did quickly. We did send a letter to Cinema and Mansion. Particularly, we have not sent a letter to all of the representatives and Congress folks. So that's something we can put on our agenda. So thank
Did
you
you
for that.
receive an answer back?
From Mantra and Cinema? No.
Yes, I got a response from Cinema.
Oh, you did?
Yes, it was very, very nebulous. It wasn't a response. It was
Thank
just,
you for your concern.
yeah,
As you, I think it's right.
Yeah, it was probably a canned response with, yeah, but I
Right.
guess.
right.
Yeah.
Which is why we got to push out to the other ones, because we know that they have their own vested interests. You know, Manchin is locked in with energy, and he's not going to budge. You know, and Sinema is just has her eye on becoming the next president of the United States. She's not going to budge, but we
Yeah.
need to move the other ones.
Yeah. So, okay,
This is a
thank
good
you,
chance.
Pierre.
Yeah, there are
Um,
many Senate seats up for election. So even if, including obviously, as I mentioned, the one right here in North Carolina. And one of the things, if you flip a seat from, in this case, Republican to Democrat, it's like you're picking up 2 votes, because they lose a Republican vote and you add a Democratic vote. So right here at home, we have a significant opportunity, and let no one think this will be an easy race.
Wonderful.
Yeah, sure, Beasley.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you again, Dr. Bremer, and everyone for joining us today and your comments. I just wanted to make sure I lifted up Richard for all his work and the many members of the Moral Message Ministry. Thank you so much for coming. There's lots of comments too about how informative and appreciating you for your time. So I wanted to also lift up those who commented on how much they enjoyed the time. Some have asked for a copy of it. So it's really nice again. And thanks so much, Richard. And that's all.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, and all the good questions. It's obvious you guys are really involved in this stuff, and it's just so important for people to be involved and stay involved. Think of this as a civil rights struggle. Think about how long it has taken to get where we are on civil rights, and we are by no means there. This is that kind of a struggle, and it should be thought of that way, as something that is part of civil rights, and as important as to our democracy as civil rights is, and something that deserves our serious attention.
Yep, thank you for that. Maybe we'll have a chance to, collaborate on something again in the future to get a little bit more leverage and power where we can afford that. So that would be great.
That'd be good. Thank you.
Thanks so very much. Have a wonderful rest of the Saturday, everyone. Enjoy the weather, and we'll see you in church.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.